Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to The Bunker. It's time for another voicemail. Today's voicemail is from an anonymous caller. Let's listen to what they have to say.
Hello, Lloyd. Thank you for your channel. I really appreciate it. And you're welcome to use this voice message on your channel, but please don't use my real name. You can call me Pete if you like. I'm probably one of your older viewers. I'm 66 years old. Help. And I've learned such a lot from your videos, not just about what's going on with Jehovah's Witnesses these days, but also about YouTube itself and Croatia. And it's quite surprised me how much I still relate to its content after all these years. And I've got a slightly unusual question to ask you at the end, but just a bit of background information. I was brought up in the Jehovah's Witnesses by my grandmother, and my parents were first sort of mildly, well, sort of half indifferent, half slightly opposed, I would say, in some ways, although they later joined it. Well, I was a teenager when I remember that 1975 prophecy. I remember that 1969 Awake, which made a big impression on me as a 14-year-old about education not being worth it. But fortunately, because my parents were not completely in the Jehovah's Witnesses at that time, I was able to escape and actually went to university. And while I was there, I've met various people and somebody trying to deprogram me, which was very unpleasant. It wasn't very loving. And I read things like George Orwell's 1984, and I was quite shocked at how accurately it described the Witness organisation. And by the time I came out of university, I was what you'd call a PMO nowadays. And although I knew it wasn't the truth, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And I just went back home and I just pretended to be in the organisation. I didn't know how to discuss my doubts with my parents. Well, I subsequently moved away from home, and many years later, I came to live in Greece for about 6 years at the end of the 1980s and early 90s. And there I met someone who introduced me to Crisis of Conscience by Ray Franz. I actually wrote to Ray Franz, and he wrote me a very nice, encouraging letter back. And I also read many other books, such as Carl Olof Johnson's Gentile Times Reconsidered, Sign of the Last Days When, James Penton's Apocalypse Delayed, and many other books. But of course, we didn't have the internet in those days, and certainly not your channel or your books. Anyway, I returned to England, and my parents eventually passed away. And I thought I'd banished my experience with the Witnesses to the back of my mind. I've recently got interested in effective altruism, and I would recommend the 80,000 Hours website to your younger listeners if they're wondering what to do with their life. Then, during the lockdown last year, out of the blue, I received a very nicely written card from an old childhood friend, presumably as part of their letter writing campaign, inviting me to come to their Zoom meetings. And the upshot of all this is I've recently started dialoguing with an elder who actually, strangely enough, has a beard. But what I wanted to ask you is would there be anything to be achieved by pretending to go back in the organisation? Because I've never been disfellowshipped, although I was baptised at the age of 17, and faking it and sowing seeds of doubt from the inside, like dropping little hints and just having little private conversations with people. I don't know what you think about that, but I'd be interested to know your views. And thanks again for your wonderful channel and all the work you're doing. It's really, really interesting. But do let me know your views. Thanks.
Well, that's a really interesting message. Thank you so much. And thanks for the kind words you have to say about my channel. It's really nice to actually hear from someone of your generation, someone who can remember what the ex-Jehovah's Witness activism scene looked like pre-internet. And I think it's wonderful that you were able to exchange correspondence with Raymond Franz, who I obviously greatly admire. Sadly, he's no longer with us, of course, but you got to receive that letter from him, which, if it had been me, and I'm sure it's the same for you, it would have been a cherished possession. But wow, really nice to hear from a viewer with that sort of pedigree in the ex-Jehovah's Witness world. As to your question, I suppose your question is it worthwhile infiltrating the organization as, I don't know, a baptized publisher, a newly baptized person or an interested person who can then have conversations with Jehovah's Witnesses and gently steer them towards the exit, sow seeds of doubt, etc. I guess it really depends on the individual. I can imagine some people would be good at that, and some people would find it not that big of a deal to join a cult for reasons other than believing the cult. And obviously, some people do this, of course. Some people get reinstated even though they have stopped believing, so that they can have contact with believing family members. So I'm aware that people go into the cult for that reason. If you're going to go into the cult and you don't have any connections, you're not doing it so that you can reestablish ties with friends and family. For me personally, I would wonder whether it's really worth it. I mean, I suppose a comparison would be during the Second World War, spies from the UK being dropped in Nazi-occupied Europe so that they can do sabotage behind enemy lines. I think in that situation, the stakes were much higher and it was far more likely that the Nazis were going to win. Whereas currently, I think the organization's already losing without us having to resort to that sort of thing. The organization is floundering in the internet age. They are struggling. We saw the numbers dip, of course, last year in 2020 for the first time in 42 years. Many will say that's due to COVID, and I think there's a lot of truth in that. However, if the organization were doing anywhere near as well as they constantly make out, COVID wouldn't have been an issue. They are struggling to keep especially the younger generation interested and engaged. Ultimately, the truth isn't on their side. They are peddling a fantasy, and it's a fantasy that unravels the moment anyone goes online and starts to do objective research into the organization. So is it worthwhile, even though our side is winning, subjecting yourself to what could be a very triggering experience of sitting through meetings and having to make professions of a faith that you don't believe in? For me personally, at least, it wouldn't be worth it. And I can imagine for some people who've had a very, very difficult background in the religion, it would be seriously detrimental to their mental health for them to subject themselves to that environment. Because I've obviously interviewed Dr. Darrell Ray on this channel about religious trauma syndrome. I think it's a real thing. I think people can be seriously traumatized. And it's possible that subjecting oneself to that environment could be seriously detrimental. However, not everyone is the same. Not everyone is necessarily traumatized. So if you feel that you can do it, I don't suppose there's anything that I can think of that would make it like unethical or anything. It would more be a case of, is it really worth it? And do you really want to put yourself through that? Obviously, it's incumbent on all Jehovah's Witnesses to do preaching. So you'd also be in a situation once things get back to normal where you're expected to go around in the community and convince people to become a Jehovah's Witness. Obviously, that's not something they're really doing at the moment, although they are sending out letters and cards, hence the reason why you're involved in all this to begin with. But when things get back to normal, I can imagine it being very difficult, if you know that it's not the truth, to be going to people's homes and, I don't know, pretending to be encouraging them to join this organization or pretending to promote this organization that you know to be not just untrue, but also abusive. Again, is it really worth going to those lengths, even though Jehovah's Witnesses are the losing side? I would argue that, again, the wind is in the sails of activists, of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, who are increasingly being heard by the media and by governments, etc., in exposing the abusive nature of this organization. So I guess the short answer is it's entirely up to you. You do what suits you the best. But I can't say that this is a strategy that I would be able to recommend to people, especially to people who have had traumatizing experiences in this organization. But thank you so much for your message nonetheless. I hope you found it helpful. If you would like to leave a voicemail, the thing to do is go to speakpipe.com/Cedars, remembering to indicate clearly if you don't want me to broadcast your message on my channel. But that's all I have time for. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lloyd Evans channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you for watching.